Among columns that now rest in silence under the weight of centuries, there once stood a city that dared to call itself eternal. Rome, the urbs aeterna, was not born merely of conquests, but of an unshakable belief that its order was the axis of the world, and that the world in all its vastness revolved around the forum, the senate, the legions, and the will of its emperors. It was a civilization that marched alongside the gods, engraved victories into stone, and shaped laws with the chisel of eternity. But time, merciless and indifferent, spares not even those who believe themselves immortal. The fall of Rome was not a single blow, but a slow extinguishing of torches, a succession of dusks that gradually submerged the empire into irreversible shadows. To understand this collapse, one must first grasp the magnitude of its promise. Rome was not merely a city, it was a symbol, an idea, a structure that transcended nations, peoples, and ages. At the height of its glory, the Roman Empire stretched from Scotland to the Sahara Desert, from Hispania to Mesopotamia. It ruled over millions of souls and united distinct cultures under a single standard, the imperial eagle. This vastness was held together by a delicate balance of military power, centralized administration, and cultural control. But when that balance began to falter, the very foundations of eternity began to tremble. The first visible sign of this twilight came with the division of the empire. In 285 after Christ, faced with a territory too vast for one man to govern alone, Emperor Diocletian made a pragmatic decision to divide Rome between East and West. Initially, it was an administrative measure, an attempt to strengthen governance, but in practice, it marked the beginning of a fracture. The East, with its capital in Constantinople, was wealthier, more urban, and better protected. The West, based in Milan and later Ravenna, was more vulnerable, pressured by unstable borders, economically weakened and politically unstable. This progressive separation between the two halves gave rise to two distinct worlds under a single banner. While the East flourished under emperors like Theodosius and later Justinian, the West sank into constant crises, successive power struggles, and civil wars. The authority of the Western emperor became symbolic, while barbarian generals began to dominate the backstage of power. The Western Empire was no longer directed from Rome, but by local interests, military advisors, and senators more concerned with preserving their privileges than protecting imperial unity. Ammianus Marcellinus, one of the last great Roman historians, described this moment with sorrow. The ancient institutions were withering. The virtues that had raised Rome to greatness were replaced by vanity, luxury, and intrigue. His account is not merely a record, but an epitaph to the Roman civic spirit. What was once a public duty became a private privilege. The Senate, once a center of debate and decision, had become an empty stage. The population, exhausted by wars, hunger, and taxes, no longer saw Rome as a mother, but as a stepmother. Yet even wounded, Rome clung to its image. Emperors continued to build triumphal arches, mint coins with their likeness, and promise the return of order. But the stones could no longer uphold the illusion. The legions were underpaid, the walls poorly guarded, the markets understocked. In the provinces, governors became lords of their own domains. Instead of a Rome that united, a Rome that unraveled was emerging. It is at this point in the narrative that modern historians such as Peter Brown and Brian Ward Perkins invite us to abandon the idea of a sudden fall. The end of Rome was not a dramatic catastrophe, but a slow erosion, almost invisible to those who lived through it. People still visited the baths, senators still convened, the gods were still invoked, but something had already been lost. Like a candle that remains lit even after the oil is gone, the empire glowed into emptiness. In this atmosphere of dissonance, the image of a world on the brink of disappearance begins to form, a world that still refuses to accept its end. This is the twilight of eternity, a moment when Rome still speaks, still breathes, still writes, but its whispers are no longer heard by a world that is turning into silence. The urbs aeterna, for the first time in its history, begins to suspect that perhaps eternity is only an illusion, and that even marble one day turns to dust. At the heart of an empire that believed itself eternal, a silent disease advanced with more devastation than any enemy sword: the corruption of the political system itself. Rome, which once rose upon the pillars of discipline, public duty, and austere republican virtue, was slowly consumed by a cycle of greed, ambition, and internal betrayal. What was once an administrative machine admired across the known world became a theater of disputes between senators, generals, courtiers, and unstable emperors. And it was in this game of vanity, far from the frontiers, that the empire began to die, from the inside out. Since the final days of the Republic, the signs had already begun to show. The concentration of power in the hands of figures like Marius, Sulla, Caesar, and later Augustus, though efficient in the short term, initiated an irreversible process of autocratic centralization. The Senate, once a symbol of collective reasoning and political balance, was gradually stripped of its power and transformed into a decorative body, tamed by emperors who tolerated no contradiction. The historian Tacitus in his Annals describes this transition with bitterness. More than ruling, the Caesars demanded worship. The empire became a court, and the citizens disguised servants. In the centuries that followed, this corroded structure revealed its full fragility. Imperial succession, lacking clear rules, became fertile ground for conspiracies, assassinations, and civil wars. Rarely was power transferred by consensus or merit. More often, it was seized by force or bought with gold. Between the 3rd and 4th centuries, the empire witnessed dozens of emperors in just a few years, many of them military men who took the throne with the support of legions bought and paid for. The so-called century of military anarchy saw emperors who ruled for months, days, or never even reached the capital alive. In such a landscape, loyalty was no longer tied to the idea of Rome, but to gold, vengeance, or mere survival. Generals were proclaimed emperors by their troops in remote camps, marched against rivals, plundered Roman cities in the name of Rome, and destroyed what remained of institutional cohesion. Central authority became an abstract notion, and the fragmentation of power deepened. The empire, already geographically split between East and West, became a political patchwork as well, with usurpers competing for legitimacy in the provinces. Corruption was not limited to the upper ranks. The Roman bureaucracy, once efficient and respected, became bloated, ineffective, and ravenous. Tax collection turned abusive, and collectors often extorted the poor in the name of a state that offered neither protection nor bread. Public offices were sold to the highest bidder, and courts of justice became arenas of bribery. St. Jerome, writing during the twilight of the empire, lamented, "Rome no longer rewards the virtuous. She enriches the cunning." These internal fractures eroded the people's trust in institutions. The senatorial class, increasingly detached from social realities, lived in palaces adorned with imported columns, while the populace starved or was forcibly conscripted into endless wars. The elites abandoned the civic ideal and surrendered to hedonism and alienation. It was a Rome that still called itself an empire, but had forgotten its soul. Contemporary historians such as Michel Rostovtsev and Peter Heather interpret this internal political collapse as one of the most critical causes of the fall. For them, the loss of legitimacy, the weakening of institutions, and the inability to renew leadership undermined not only administration, but the very idea of being Roman. When an empire ceases to inspire loyalty, it no longer governs through authority, it governs through fear. And fear, as we know, never builds a lasting civilization. Thus, the fractures that split open within Rome were not merely cracks in the marble of the Senate or in the columns of its temples. They were ruptures in the soul of an empire that had forgotten its purpose. And while enemies knocked at the gates within the walls, men debated titles, usurped thrones, and bargained away the future for poisoned coins. Rome did not fall merely because it was attacked. It fell because it was already collapsing from within, slowly, silently, like a giant bleeding without realizing it. While emperors vied for power and the legions multiplied in both internal and external wars, a more insidious poison was corroding Rome's foundations, the collapse of its economy. For centuries, the Roman Empire had sustained its vastness through an admirable network of roads, trade routes, taxes, and spoils. But what once fed the imperial machine with abundance gradually became an unbearable burden. Gold grew scarce. The currency lost its value, and the citizens, already weary from political insecurity, were crushed by a fiscal system that pushed them into misery. It was not a sudden disaster. It was a progressive exhaustion, a slow moral and material bankruptcy of an empire that had forgotten even eternity requires balance. The 3rd century after Christ marked the beginning of Rome's financial collapse. Civil wars and the constant threat of invasions forced emperors to maintain ever larger and more expensive armies. The cost of feeding, clothing, and paying soldiers rose dramatically. To finance this apparatus, the state began to issue more coins, but without corresponding reserves in silver or gold. The result was inflation. Coins once rich in precious metal were now made with poor alloys, containing less and less silver. The Roman currency became the symbol of a broken promise. It had form but no value. The people noticed, merchants too, and trust, that invisible and indispensable asset, vanished. Emperor Diocletian, aware of the chaos, attempted to restore order through radical reforms. In 301 after Christ, he issued the famous Edict on Maximum Prices, a desperate effort to control inflation by fixing prices and wages across the empire. But the edict failed. Instead of stability, it created shortages. Merchants preferred to hide their goods rather than sell them at fixed prices. The informal economy expanded, and the market, that organic force which does not yield to decrees, responded with contraction. Money ceased to circulate, and hunger, always lurking, found new paths to enter. But perhaps the most brutal blow came from the tax system itself. To keep the empire functioning, Rome began to impose increasingly higher taxes. Provinces were squeezed, peasants overburdened, small landowners ruined. Many, unable to pay, abandoned their lands. Others fell into the servitude of large landowners in exchange for protection. Thus was born the seed of the feudal system that would dominate Europe after the empire's fall. Social mobility disappeared. Inequality deepened. The sense of belonging to the empire, once a source of pride, became an unbearable burden. Ancient sources, like the historian Zosimus, describe this period as a time when taxes were more feared than the barbarians. The phrase encapsulates the complete inversion of imperial logic. The state, which once existed to protect, had become something citizens wished to escape. Cities began to empty. Urban life fell into decay. Artisans abandoned their workshops. Merchants closed their shops. And the roads that once pulsed with commerce between Gaul, Africa, and Asia became dangerous and desolate. In addition, territorial loss worsened the crisis. Regions like Egypt, essential for grain supply, faced instability. North Africa, the empire's granary, was gradually overtaken by Vandal tribes. As a result, costs increased while revenues plummeted. The empire needed more money to survive, but it produced less. The equation was unsustainable. Contemporary historian Kyle Harper observes that Rome's economic crisis was not only financial, it was also ecological and social. Droughts, outbreaks of plague, and climate shifts affected harvests and entire populations, leaving the system even more vulnerable. The Roman economy, though advanced, lacked the resilience to endure successive collapses, and when the economic foundation crumbled, it dragged down the social, political, and military pillars with it. By the end of this process, what remained of Rome was an economy that no longer functioned as an empire, but as a patchwork of isolated, impoverished local economies. Coins were rejected, taxes provoked panic, and the very concept of a Roman state began to fade from daily life. It was no longer an empire sustaining its people, it was the people by force, sustaining an illusion that had already failed. Rome, once proud of its full granaries, its vibrant markets, and its impeccable supply engineering, was now a starving empire. Starving for resources, for hope, for a future. The economic crisis was not merely one factor in the fall, it was the backdrop against which all other ruins unfolded. When bread disappeared, not even circuses could keep the people quiet. And an empire that does not feed its people does not deserve to stand. There was a time when the Roman Empire stretched like a continuous wall of power, guarding a vast world under a single name. But as the centuries passed, that wall began to crack. The tensions between the eastern and western parts of the empire, once mere administrative differences, deepened into political, cultural, and economic abysses. And it was in this growing chasm, between Constantinople and Rome, between the resilient East and the vulnerable West, that the empire began to lose itself. The division of the empire, formalized on paper, only crystallized a separation that had long existed in the hearts of its people. And more than a territorial reorganization, it sealed the fate of a world that ceased to be united, becoming fragmented, divided, and alone. In 285 after Christ, Emperor Diocletian established what became known as the Tetrarchy, a system of shared government between two Augusti and two Caesars, each responsible for a portion of the empire. The intention was clear: to face more effectively the military and administrative crises afflicting the borders. But like so many Roman remedies, the antidote became poison. Decentralization gave rise to rivalry. The singular authority, that sacred symbol upholding the imperial cult, dissolved. Over time, the Tetrarchy collapsed, but the idea of division remained. And in 395 after Christ, after the death of Emperor Theodosius I, his sons Honorius and Arcadius officially assumed command of the western and eastern halves of the empire. It was the formal beginning of the separation. Strategically, the East always held natural advantages. Constantinople, founded by Constantine atop ancient Byzantium, was built to be impenetrable. Nestled between the Sea of Marmara and the Golden Horn, surrounded by colossal walls, rich in commerce and close to the Silk Roads and Middle Eastern cultures, the new capital thrived. It boasted a solid economic base, a more urbanized population, and a more stable administrative elite. Meanwhile, the West bled. Rome was no longer the seat of imperial power, replaced by Ravenna, encircled by swamps. But not even the swamps could hold back the ghosts of decline. From that point forward, the differences between the two empires deepened. In the East, emperors had greater control over the bureaucracy, better fiscal capacity, and less immediate military pressure on their borders. In the West, the Rhine and Danube frontiers were in a constant state of emergency. Germanic peoples pressed with increasing frequency. Western Roman generals, unable to recruit enough soldiers, began hiring barbarian contingents, granting them land and authority in exchange for protection. It was a desperate trade, power for security. But in handing parts of the empire to foreign peoples, the West signed its own death sentence. The letters exchanged between the two emperors reveal not just political protocol, but an emotional distance that continued to grow. The East began to see the West as a burden, an unstable, expensive, and risky region. When Pope Leo I pleaded for Eastern help during the sackings of Rome, the response was hesitant, cold, almost perfunctory. The concept of a united empire had by then become just a memory. As historian Avril Cameron aptly notes, the East did not save the West because, deep down, it no longer saw itself as part of the same body. This isolation created a vicious cycle. The weaker the West became, the more the East withdrew. The more the East withdrew, the more vulnerable the West became. The Western Roman institutions, already fragile, collapsed under the weight of abandonment. The Roman Senate, once the highest symbol of the Republic, became irrelevant. Roman roads crumbled from neglect. Cities lost autonomy and wealth. Trade vanished. The soul of Rome, fragmented between the echoes of its past and the silence of its present, wandered aimlessly among walls that no longer protected anyone. The isolation was not merely physical, it was cultural. In the East, Greek became the dominant language. Christian values were absorbed and adapted into imperial power with greater fluidity. The Byzantine court developed its own style, with intricate rituals and a refined theological vision. Meanwhile, the West sank into a more apocalyptic, rigid and desperate form of Christianity. Latin persisted, but its symbolic power faded, and with it so too faded the sense of continuity, of identity, of empire. The division of the empire was not just a political measure, it was a reflection of a world that no longer recognized itself in the mirror of its former glories. A divided empire is not merely a smaller empire, it is a more fragile one, more vulnerable, closer to death. Rome, the city that once saw itself as the center of the universe, had become a periphery of itself, and in that growing distance between brothers, between East and West, the fate of a civilization was sealed. For the first time, Rome felt truly alone, and an empire alone is an empire at the edge of its end. When one thinks of the fall of Rome, the popular imagination often conjures images of barbarian hordes breaching walls, setting cities ablaze, looting temples, and leaving a trail of chaos across what was once the heart of the world. But the barbarian invasions, though brutal and decisive in action, were not lightning bolts across a clear sky. They were the result, and also the catalyst of a deeper process. An empire exhausted, divided and weakened, no longer strong enough to lift its own swords. The barbarians did not create Rome's ruin. They simply arrived to inhabit it. For centuries, the Germanic peoples and their northern neighbors had maintained an ambiguous relationship with the empire. They were seen as enemies, yes, but also as temporary allies, mercenary soldiers, traders, and in some cases settlers allowed to live on the empire's fringes. This model of coexistence, however, was based on a fragile balance, upheld by weak treaties and militarized borders. With the economic and political collapse of the West, those borders became porous, and through them, the unthinkable entered. The year 376 after Christ marks a turning point. Besieged by the Huns, a nomadic people from the Central Asian steppes, the Goths sought refuge within Roman territory. The weakened empire allowed them entry, believing it could control them and convert them into allies. But Roman officials treated them with cruelty, demanding money, inflating food prices, and exploiting the refugees with brutal indifference. Rebellion was inevitable. 2 years later, in 378, came the Battle of Adrianople, one of the most humiliating defeats in Roman history. Emperor Valens was killed, and 2/3 of the Roman army perished. For the first time, Rome could not contain an invasion within its own land. From that moment on, psychological barriers also collapsed. The Visigoths, led by Alaric, roamed the empire like an army outside the order. In 410 after Christ, they took Rome. The Eternal City, untouched for nearly 800 years, fell to forces that once would never have crossed its gates. The shock was profound. Saint Jerome, writing from Bethlehem, lamented, "The world collapsed. Rome has fallen. Who can be saved?" The symbolic capital of the empire had been sacked, and with it the myth of Roman invincibility crumbled. In the years that followed, other peoples followed the same path. Vandals, Suebi, and Alans crossed the frozen Rhine in 406 after Christ, spreading across Gaul and Hispania. The Vandals, in particular, advanced into North Africa, a strategic region for grain supply, and seized Carthage in 439. In 455, they returned to sack Rome again, with such violence that their name became synonymous with destruction. From that point forward, the city, though still revered, lost any illusion of centrality. It was a shattered icon, without real power, without defenses, without answers. Meanwhile, the Huns, led by Attila, the so-called Scourge of God, sowed terror across Central and Italian Europe. In 451, they were met at the Battle of the Catalonian Plains, where a Roman-Germanic alliance managed to halt them, but the fear they spread would linger for generations. Pope Leo V, with courage and diplomacy, managed to persuade Attila not to sack Rome in 452, one of the last symbolic triumphs of the Church amidst the imperial collapse. Still, the Hunnic presence was not the end. It was just one more piece in the mosaic of downfall. It is important to note, many of the so-called barbarian peoples did not seek to destroy Rome. They admired it. They longed to partake in its structure, to enjoy its prestige, to live under its laws. But Rome could no longer absorb them. The machine had stopped. There was no more bread, no more land, no more legions strong enough to guarantee integration. And so, the empire was occupied from within, not by foreign armies, but by peoples who were already there, waiting, watching, arming themselves. Cassius Dio, writing a century earlier, had already foreseen what would come. "I do not fear the barbarians at the borders. I fear the men we have let in without realizing it." His words echo like a prophetic whisper. The line between civilization and invasion became increasingly blurred, and in the end, there was no final battle, no total destruction. There was only a transition from one world to another, guided by peoples who inherited the ruins of an empire and reshaped it in their own image. The barbarian invasions were not a momentary siege. They were a slow and inevitable replacement. Rome, exhausted and broken, was not conquered. It was abandoned, reshaped, reused. The walls still stood, but within them the empire no longer lived. Only memories, ashes, and silent statues remained. To truly understand the fall of Rome, one must set aside for a moment the image of broken columns in the Forum or legions defeated on distant battlefields. The ruin of an empire does not occur only at its center, but also, and perhaps most of all, at its edges. Along the once guarded frontiers, in now silent provincial towns, in abandoned fields and on roads where no one travels anymore. It was in the forgotten provinces, in the regions that once fed the heart of Rome, that the idea of empire began to die. And when the center abandons its extremities, when power folds in on itself and no longer protects those who sustain it, then the empire has already fallen, even if its capital still draws breath. The Roman provinces, spread across 3 continents, were the material and symbolic foundation of imperial power. From Hispania to Thrace, from Gaul to Syria, from Egypt to North Africa, these lands supplied food, minerals, soldiers, and taxes. But as Rome weakened, these regions ceased to be seen as essential parts of the imperial organism and began to be treated as zones of extraction. The bond between center and periphery, once rooted in pride and citizenship, was replaced by resentment, neglect, and abandonment. The first sign of this rupture was economic. The provinces were burdened with ever-increasing taxes, demanded to sustain an empire that no longer returned protection or infrastructure. Tax collection became brutal, blind to local crises. When harvests failed or invaders threatened villages and farms, Rome's answer was silence. The local elite, pressured and impoverished, stopped investing in public works or supporting the legions. Once vibrant cities like Lutetia, Lugdunum, Carthage, and Tyre entered accelerated decline. Forums emptied, markets disappeared, and with them, the very idea of Rome as a benefactor vanished. Politically, the provinces began to organize on their own. Governors, often cut off from effective communication with the center, acted as autonomous leaders. Sometimes they declared loyalty to the emperor, sometimes they did not. It was the beginning of the political fragmentation that would lead to the formation of barbarian kingdoms and the rise of early medieval identities. Allegiance to Rome was replaced by local loyalties, to new chieftains, bishops, military leaders. The empire still existed on maps and in official documents, but outside its walls, it was no longer recognized as practical authority. Historian Peter Heather notes that for a farmer in Gaul or a fisherman in Dalmatia, the idea of being Roman lost tangible meaning. There were no longer soldiers to protect them, judges to hear them, merchants to trade with. Only the burden of imperial taxation remained. When an empire stops protecting but continues demanding, it becomes tyranny. And tyranny inspires no loyalty, only resistance and indifference. Another decisive factor in the abandonment of the provinces was Rome's logistical inability to maintain roads, aqueducts, walls, and granaries. The once famous network of Roman roads, which connected every corner of the empire to the center, like arteries of a great body, became impassable in many areas. As security along routes declined, internal trade collapsed. Cities that once thrived through the flow of goods and ideas became isolated enclaves. Without timber, iron, or tools, former urban centers turned to ruins. In many places, people returned to subsistence farming, living among the remnants of temples and palaces that now served only as shelter from the rain. Culturally, the separation was equally stark. The Latinization of the provinces, so strong during centuries of expansion, began to reverse. Local languages re-emerged. Traditional cults gave way to new religious expressions. Ties to Rome became memory, and memory, like old coins, loses value when it is no longer part of daily life. The abandonment of the provinces was not merely a consequence of decline. It was a strategic decision made for survival. Realizing it could no longer protect everything, Rome chose to protect only itself. But an empire that defends only its core is no longer an empire. It is a fortress surrounded by silence. And silence, on the margins, is the herald of the end. The French historian Henri-Irénée Marrou once said, "An empire that abandons its provinces also abandons its soul." And Rome, in forgetting its margins, forgot who it was. An empire made of diverse peoples, of distant voices, of interwoven cultures. An empire that once took pride in integrating and had become content with exploiting. And so, while emperors continued to rule from distant thrones and senators debated beneath echoing domes, the empire crumbled in the hands of those who had been left behind. For Rome did not fall from the outside alone. It dissolved in the forgotten corners of itself. Few transformations marked the destiny of Rome as deeply as the emergence and rise of Christianity, not as an isolated cause of its fall, as some 18th century thinkers simplistically claimed, but as one of the most powerful elements in the spiritual, moral, and institutional reconfiguration of the empire. Christianity did not arrive in Rome as a conqueror, but as a seed planted in the shadows. It grew in the catacombs on the margins of power, among slaves, women, and the persecuted. But over time, it rose as the new moral pillar of the West, challenging the old gods, questioning the imperial cult, and redrawing the notion of authority. When Rome fell, it was no longer the same, and Christianity, already consolidated, not only survived the collapse, it inherited its invisible throne. During the first 3 centuries, Christians were persecuted with varying intensity, not because they were seen as heretics, but as subversives. The empire was tolerant of many gods, but not of exclusive religions. Christianity rejected the cult of the emperor, refused to participate in public rites, and placed its loyalty above civic duty. For an empire founded on the pact between religion and state, this was intolerable, and so Christians were tortured, killed, marginalized, but never silenced. As Tertullian wrote in the 2nd century, "The blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church." The turning point came in the 4th century. In 313 after Christ, with the Edict of Milan, Constantine legalized Christianity. In 380, Emperor Theodosius declared it the official religion of the empire. From then on, what had once been a clandestine faith became an institutional pillar. Churches were built with imperial support, bishops gained legal power, and the ecclesiastical structure began to intertwine with Rome's administrative system. But this victory came at a price. Christianity ceased to be purely spiritual and became political as well. The faith was institutionalized, and with it, contradictions emerged that would echo for centuries. For defenders of the old order, this change was traumatic. Paganism was not just belief, and it was culture, memory, identity. Temples were civic centers, rituals, expressions of belonging. With the banning of traditional cults, a part of Rome was erased. The closure of the Temple of Vesta, the end of the pagan Olympic Games, the destruction of millennia-old idols, for many, these were the true end of ancient Rome. The poet Claudian mourned, "The gods have left their hills, and Rome no longer shines." For these Romans, the new faith did not unify, it divided. Yet Christianity also offered something Rome could no longer provide: hope. In times of crisis, famine, war, and insecurity, the Christian message spoke of redemption, eternal justice, and the intrinsic value of each human being. Martyrs became heroes, priests, advisors, and churches, places of refuge and solidarity. The new spiritual order began to fill the void left by the collapse of the political one, and so slowly the empire came to be guided not by imperial eagles, but by the symbols of the cross. This transition brought practical changes. Power became decentralized. As the emperor lost authority, bishops gained prestige. In many cities, it was the bishop who organized food distribution, administered justice, and coordinated defense against invaders. The church took over the functions the state had abandoned, and in this sense it did not destroy Rome. It saved what it could of her. Intellectually, Christianity offered a new worldview. St. Augustine, in his work, The City of God, written after the sack of Rome by the Visigoths, argued that the true empire was not earthly, but spiritual. Rome would fall, but faith would endure. This idea gave meaning to the tragedy. It transformed the empire's collapse into part of a divine plan, and offered Romans a new identity, no longer citizens of a terrestrial city, but pilgrims on the road to the heavenly Jerusalem. Even so, the process was marked by tension. Not all Christians agreed with the use of force, the persecution of pagans, or the fusion of church and state. There was resistance, there were schisms, there was violence, but the movement was inevitable. The empire that once killed Christians ended up being shaped by them. And when its crown fell to the ground, it was the church that picked it up, using Rome's rubble to build the foundations of the Middle Ages. Therefore, Christianity did not bring down Rome. It transformed it. It transplanted its symbols. It redefined its values. And in place of an eternity made of marble and conquest, it planted a new eternity, made of faith, sacrifice, and redemption. The empire faded, but the Roman spirit endured, now clothed in tunic, cross, and silence. Amid the ruins of the empire, something even more silent and devastating than the loss of cities and legions was unfolding: the erosion of culture. Rome, which for centuries had been not only a political and military center, but also a beacon of knowledge, beauty, and memory, was descending into a long and heavy night, where libraries were abandoned, schools closed, artworks forgotten, and knowledge that had crossed generations vanished as if it had never existed. The cultural collapse of Rome was perhaps the deepest and most tragic aspect of its dissolution. For while walls can be rebuilt, once memory fades, it rarely returns. During its golden centuries, Rome was a powerhouse of knowledge and preservation. Heir to the Greek legacy, the imperial capital was home to schools of rhetoric, philosophy, medicine, and law. Noble households held scrolls of Virgil, Cicero, Homer, and Galen. Public libraries, like that of Alexandria in Roman Egypt, safeguarded centuries of wisdom. Culture was a noble currency. Mastery of eloquence was a requirement for power. To read and interpret classical texts was the mark of the elite. It was an empire of logos, of reason, of language, of discourse. But as political strength waned and economic crisis deepened, education was slowly pushed aside. Public schools lost funding, teachers stopped receiving salaries, and students, many now without hope of social advancement, abandoned the study of letters and philosophy. In the place of discourse came fear. In the place of debate, dogma. Cities ceased to be cultural hubs and became fortresses against hunger and barbarians. In many regions, illiteracy spread. Entire families no longer knew how to read. Books became rare and therefore precious. Copied by hand in monastic or aristocratic scriptoria, classical texts began to disappear due to lack of scribes, ink, and time. Many works by foundational authors were lost in this process, known today only through fragments or the mentions of later writers. The French historian Pierre Grimal once wrote, "More than destroying Rome, the fall of the empire destroyed the dialogue with the dead, and with that, we lost a part of ourselves." Art followed a similar fate. Statues of gods were destroyed or mutilated. Mosaics were whitewashed. Frescoes washed away by rains pouring through collapsed roofs. The naturalistic and balanced style of Greco-Roman art gave way to more symbolic, abstract, rigid forms, many tied to the new Christian faith. Not by chance. The New Age no longer sought to represent the perfection of the human form, but to evoke divine fear and detachment from the world. It was an aesthetic of transition, a grieving art. Architecture, once proud, also collapsed. Great engineering projects ceased. Arches, aqueducts, basilicas all required constant maintenance, technical knowledge, calculations, and materials. But Rome no longer had enough engineers. The expertise that built the Colosseum or the Pantheon began to fade, not out of ignorance, but disuse. And what is not used, rusts. The philosopher and jurist Boethius, considered the last classical Roman intellectual, was executed in 524. With him, not only was a brilliant mind lost, a bridge between the ancient world and the one to come was broken. His work, The Consolation of Philosophy, was read throughout the Middle Ages, but his death signaled to the world that to think was no longer a priority. It was a threat. Even Roman law, the basis of many modern legal systems, was disfigured. Without legal schools, codes became confusing, regional, and arbitrary. The clarity of the corpus juris civilis would only be restored and preserved in the East by Justinian in the 6th century. In the West, Roman law sank into a tangle of barbarian customs, local rules, and religious decrees. Reason gave way to superstition. Balance yielded to fear. Yet among the ashes, some embers remained lit. Christian monasteries, though limited in access, became guardians of knowledge. Many monks copied ancient books with reverence. They preserved Cicero, Aristotle, Pliny, but they did so out of devotion, not a desire for debate or discovery. The Roman critical spirit, the one that questioned the gods, challenged tyrants and debated with sophists, that spirit was lost. What survived was the skeleton, the letter, but not the breath. Roman culture was not destroyed like a sudden blaze. It was abandoned, forgotten, silenced by hunger and urgency, and what had once been an empire of marble and ideas became a landscape of stone and whispers. And yet, in the ruins, in the surviving pages, in the echo of a poem by Horace or a law of Cicero, Rome still whispers, and those who listen carefully can feel it. Culture does not die. It sleeps, awaiting another empire, not of soldiers and emperors, but of readers. In the vast theatre of history, certain characters step onto the stage not to lead glorious acts, but to symbolize the closing of an era. So it was with Romulus Augustulus, a child-crowned emperor, a name heavy with omens, and a fate that would quietly seal the formal end of the Western Roman Empire. In 476 after Christ, there were no great battles, no crowds crying in the streets, just a silent gesture, the deposition of a boy who had barely grasped the weight of the crown placed upon his head, and so, in silence, Rome, the eternal, fell asleep. The context in which Romulus Augustulus ascended the throne was already that of an empire on the edge of complete collapse. Real power rested in the hands of his father, Orestes, a former secretary of Attila who, upon returning to Roman politics, deposed Emperor Julius Nepos and proclaimed his own son as the new ruler, a boy perhaps 14 or 15 years old. The name choice seemed a final nod to heroic times. Romulus, like the mythical founder of the city, Augustus, like its first true emperor. But the grandeur of the name contrasted with the fragility of reality. Romulus commanded no armies, had no popular support, and ruled over an empire that no longer existed in anything but name. Italy was surrounded by Germanic peoples, Heruli, Ostrogoths, Vandals, many of whom already ruled former Roman provinces as de facto sovereigns. The Western Roman army had become a patchwork of mostly barbarian mercenaries, poorly paid and poorly led. In this setting rose Odoacer, a Heruli military chief who, speaking for his soldiers, demanded lands in Italy. Orestes refused and paid the price. He was captured and executed in Ravenna, then the empire's capital. Days later, his son Romulus Augustulus was deposed, but curiously spared. Odoacer did not kill the young emperor. On the contrary, he sent him to a villa in Campania, granted him a pension, and allowed him to live in peace, far from imperial intrigues. It was a symbolic gesture. Roman royalty was no longer dangerous. It no longer inspired fear. Romulus Augustulus became a living shadow of an extinct throne, a boy who no longer needed to die because the empire he belonged to had already ceased to exist. This moment, seemingly quiet, echoed deeply. In 476, the Western Roman throne was officially abolished. Odoacer declared loyalty to the Eastern Emperor, Zeno, and governed Italy as king under nominal Byzantine authority. But everyone knew Rome as a sovereign Western entity had come to an end without explosions, without fires, without weeping multitudes, just a document, a resignation, a silence. The Byzantine historian Malchus of Philadelphia recorded, "The majesty of Rome was deposed without a fight, as if the world had decided her existence was no longer necessary." And indeed, it was a symbolic fall. The empire had already lost Africa to the Vandals, Gaul to the Franks, Hispania to the Swabian Visigoths. All that remained was Italy, and even it now was barbarian territory with a Roman veneer. The image of Romulus Augustulus is deeply moving. A boy, symbol of an empire founded 1,000 years earlier by another Romulus, now closing the cycle. The eternal city, which had resisted Carthaginians, Gauls, Parthians, and Huns, now disappeared quietly at the hand of a barbarian general, and without resistance. It was an end that needed no war, because there was no longer Rome in Rome, only a name. And names do not fight, they whisper or fade. The symbolism is profound. The boy emperor survived, but the idea of Rome as ruler of the West, as organizer of the world, as axis of time and civilization, died in that moment, in peaceful resignation, in administrative silence, in the serene acceptance that the gods had already left. Some historians, like Edward Gibbon, define this moment as the official fall of the Roman Empire. Others, more modern, like Peter Brown, prefer to see it as a transition, a metamorphosis. But even among the most nuanced interpretations, one point remains. 476 after Christ was more than a date. It was a mirror, and in it, Rome saw that it no longer was, and perhaps never would be again. Rome fell. Its emperors ceased to reign. Its legions stopped marching. Its senators no longer debated beneath marble domes. The provinces were lost, the temples looted, the palaces crumbled. But there is something in Rome that neither sword nor time nor the dust of centuries could erase. Because Rome was not merely a city or an empire. Rome was an idea, a language, an invisible code that would continue to pulse through every stone raised in Europe, every book written, every law proclaimed, every symphony of Western civilization. The physical Rome fell, but its soul never did. After the fall of the Western Empire, many feared the world would plunge into eternal darkness. And indeed, the Middle Ages brought deep challenges, endless wars, urban collapse, misery, isolation. But even in the darkness, Rome whispered. Monks copied Cicero, Virgil, Pliny, Augustine. Churches were built using repurposed Roman columns. Barbarian kings, many of them illiterate, called themselves heirs to Roman greatness. To be Roman, even after the fall, was an invisible medal of prestige, a seal of legitimacy. The Byzantine Empire or Eastern Roman Empire would survive for another 1,000 years. Its citizens called themselves Romans. Its emperors ruled from Constantinople with the title Basileus ton Romaion, Emperor of the Romans. Even the Arabs, in their chronicles, referred to the Byzantines as Rum. Rome lived on in the East, but more than that, it lived on in the structure of things, in law, in language, in architecture, in thought. Roman law, codified by Justinian in his monumental Corpus Juris Civilis, became the foundation of canon law and, later, of nearly every continental European legal system. The idea of the Republic, abandoned by the imperial Romans, would be reborn in the Renaissance as the ideal model of civilized governance. The very word civilization, from the Latin civitas, carries Rome at its root. And so every modern parliament, every court, every public square carries within it an echo of the Rome that was. In language, Latin survived as the mother of living tongues: Portuguese, Spanish, French, Italian, Romanian. Even peoples who do not speak Romance languages retain Latin words in their scientific, legal, and religious vocabularies. In every Catholic prayer, in every medical term, in every legal maxim, Rome is present, because Latin is not a dead language. It is a living memory that walks disguised in the speech of nations. In art, Rome re-emerged in countless forms. The Renaissance took her as its muse. Artists like Michelangelo, Raphael, and Leonardo sought perfection in Roman statues. Renaissance architects studied the Pantheon to build churches and palaces. Poets revived Latin genres. Even in modern revolutions, Roman symbols were revived. The eagle of the empire was adopted by Napoleon, by the United States, by Germany. The fascination with Rome transcended ideologies, eras, and borders. In religion, Rome became a spiritual capital. The Bishop of Rome, once persecuted, became Pope. And the Catholic Church, the longest-standing institution in Western history, built its foundation upon the ruins of empire. The Vatican, as an ecclesiastical entity, occupies the same soil that once saw triumphal parades and imperial conspiracies. St. Peter's Basilica stands atop the remains of Nero's circus. The Christian altar is anchored in the blood of Roman martyrs. The transition from empire to Christendom was not merely historical, it was symbolic. Even in collective memory, Rome never disappeared. It was reinvented. It became the setting of films, books, documentaries, video games. It is studied, admired, questioned. Rome has not been forgotten. On the contrary, it has never been more remembered. And in every reconstruction, even romanticized or partial, there is reverence. There is a desire to understand how one people could build so much, last so long, influence so deeply. The French historian Paul Vane once wrote, "Rome did not disappear, it dissolved into the blood of the world." And it's true. There is no modern city in the West that lacks a Roman touch. No school of philosophy or law that does not reference its thinkers, its lawmakers, its paradoxes. Rome was, and remains, a foundation upon which we build, even unconsciously, the present. Thus perhaps Rome did not fall. Perhaps it simply changed shape. It transmuted. It spread like pollen across the earth. It ceased to be marble to become memory, ceased to be sword to become word. And in the end, as Jorge Luis Borges once wrote, "We are all Romans even when we forget it." Rome does not die. Rome lives on in what endures. And as long as there are those who listen, who study, who dream, Rome will still speak.